Clapper board, you're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled Galaxy Empire Invaded Earth. We warned them. Run now, HFY sci-fi story. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. The night the first shadows fell across the Pacific, the air tasted like copper and old rain, and the lights of the California coastline flickered as if the ocean were breathing again after a long sleep. Cargo ships drifted without engines. Jetliners glided in silence and landed on freeways, the pilots weeping, hands shaking over dead control panels. Submarines surfaced with hatch crews in ripped orange suits, staring at the bruised sky. And somewhere under the Rockies, deep in concrete roots and cold steel arteries, the last secure signal hummed to life and asked a question no one had wanted to speak aloud for 100 years. How long until we are not alone? The answer came as a voice, too smooth, too deliberate, like it had never learned to hesitate. It didn't crackle, it seeped into every frequency and filled the world with the gravity of a cathedral. You have trespassed upon the silence of the stars. You are observed. You will become compliant. This is mercy. Every city, every village, every ship and farmhouse heard it. And in kitchens and tunnels and hospital corridors, people did the strangest thing. They smiled. They had prayed not to be alone in the dark. Now they were seen, and being seen was not the same as being understood. A stubborn heat lit behind human eyes, the old fire kindled by storms and famines and tyrants, and all the things that kept trying to erase us. Atlas Command blinked awake in the mountain's heart like an animal's eye. Banks of equipment whispered and clicked. Fans whirred up from their long dream, and the last of the old satellites, scorched, misaligned, patched with unholy repairs, gave one more gift to their makers, a view. The ships were wrong, not just the size, continents of hullwork, palace spires, and moving scars, but the way they moved as a thought moves, as a command becomes a motion without any gap for doubt. Every angle radiated intent and history. They were covered in crimson sigils that pulsed as if the ships themselves were breathing. Around them, the rift boiled like torn silk. The fleet took position like a lid placed over a jar. Major Elias Ward stood with his fists planted on the console edge and watched the projection reassemble into vectors and probabilities. He had the face of a man who'd slept in his boots more years than he hadn't. A scar crossed his mouth. It never quite healed, because he never quite gave it permission. Around him, analysts murmured, fingers hawking over keyboards, hydras of cable bundling across the floor. A young systems engineer, Ree Kotri, unspooled a fiber like thread from a loom, eyes red, hair pinned back with a bit of wire. When the lights dimmed again, no one flinched. They all leaned closer. "We're blind in orbit," said Ree, "but ground radar still got bones. They're staging over major population centers. Not landing, posture looks punitive." Ward nodded once. "They want us to kneel before we're allowed to die." Somewhere a coffee cup rattled. No one dared pick it up. A message light bloomed. Re-tapped the answer key and a face appeared, washed gray by fluorescent striping. General Vasquez, hair clipped down to iron, eyes like pewter set in stone. "We've lost 32 sites," she said, voice hoarse. "And 3 cities to precision vaporization. They are doing triage." Word staggered. "We need Atlas online. I don't care what you break to do it." Ward didn't salute, he lifted his chin. "Yes, ma'am." The first beam fell on Shanghai at noon. It didn't arrive as light, it arrived as pressure, a silent hammer, a hole kicked in the air. Buildings folded as if they were paper models, the river leapt straight up like a skewered dragon, and the sky turned to a mirror so bright that the shadows had edges. The second beam walked across Brazil at twilight, turning rainforests to glassy sheets that snapped in their own cooling. The third hit the Mediterranean. Steam spiraled like the birth of a ghost ocean. Radios choked on screaming and prayers and instruction manuals recited by autofocus AI that didn't know how else to die. In the lull between impacts, Atlas Command found its rhythm. The Aegis lattice, half rumor, half fever dream, staggered to its feet with the creak of scavenged code. It had been assembled out of disused civilian networks, a mothballed planetary defense grid, repurposed gaming clusters, black-budget prototypes, and the insatiable appetite of a new adaptive core. For a heartbeat, it looked like it would eat its own tail. Then it began to purr. "Talk to me," Ward said. Ree's fingers moved like a pianist's over a cracked keyboard. "We can't match them in orbit," she said, "but they are talking to themselves constantly. The command fabric is thick, redundant, and arrogant. Sir, I can spoof their gravity vector verifiers if I get 3 clean captures. If I can speak their language the way they speak to their own limbs, I can make their limbs twitch." Ward's scar pulled tight. "Do it." In ruined streets, in sewers running hot from broken mains, on deserted freeways under punched-out sky, people started saving one another like it was a reflex. Near Santa Fe, a school bus driver loaded 3 kids per seat and never let the bus stop rolling. When the road buckled, he simply turned across the desert and followed the sun. In Reykjavik, a violinist led 30 people into the service corridors of a geothermal plant and kept them moving by playing reels until her bow frayed. In Alexandria, a grandmother with a butcher's knife and a missing shoe walked down a collapsed stairwell and told 20 strangers to hold hands because she didn't own enough courage to give to each of them separately. On an empty beach in the Philippines, a fisherwoman wrote her son's name into wet sand and watched a dark triangle rise out of the sea like a nightmare, a scouting drone with a snake's bright eye. She threw her net at it, and for an instant the machine was fish caught, and she leapt on it with a bottle and a curse and a laugh like someone had dared her and she had said yes. Humanity didn't coordinate at first, it convulsed. But the convulsions had pattern, and the pattern became a habit, and the habit became a plan. When the first Kaldrith cohort came down, they didn't land in the ruins. They landed where the signal was loudest here on Earth, the places where orders used to start and end, where flags had flown, where parades turned oil into thunder. They came down in gliding palanquins like knives unwrapped from velvet, and their armor drank light. They were tall enough to make men step back without meaning to, their curled horns etched with beaded glyphs, their eyes burning like iron in a forge. They spoke in that same perfect voice out of Vox throats and offered terms that were not terms. They found not silence but ghosts in the rubbled streets, heat signatures that slipped behind columns and down storm drains, and they heard, in the static their own sensors considered irrelevant, a whisper, "Run now." The first time it happened, the whisper bled across their officers' channel seconds before an entire cohort's exoskeletal comms shut down as if a hand had clapped over their mouths. The second time it was followed by 50 bulldozers with school bus armor, oncoming as if vengeance had wheels and couldn't stop. The third time, in the ruined scaffolds of Johannesburg, the whisper was a lure toward a metro station whose ceiling was webbed with copper wire and explosive bolts. The Kaldrith shredded it from afar, and the scaffolding fell with the neatness of a side "no." And out of the settling dust rose a single human, helmeted, clutching what the Kaldrith would later name the Ward device, a chain of compressed ferromagnets, and a fist-sized reactor that turned their energy shields into thirsty mouths swallowing a bomb. She died because someone always did, 3 cohorts with her. Above the Atlantic, the obsidian halo hung as if it had decided to learn patient cruelty. It staked the sea with needles of red light, tasting, sampling, learning how our world flexed when it was touched in certain places. Ward watched it on the bunker screen until his jaw ached. "Give me its heartbeat," he told Aegis. "I can give you the rhythm of its teeth." The AI said, its voice still raw with newness. "It chews power through repeating gulps. Between the gulps there is a swallow. I can make the swallow last forever if you'll give me permission to lie convincingly. Lie, Ward said. Convince. The Atlantic slept in slate shades. The behemoth dimmed one bank of cannon for a momentary reroute, a ghost of pause that Aegis had stretched into a second and a half, an eternity to things moving at light. Out of the cold, black water rose a crawling garden of drones, too many to count, seeds of plastic and carbon and rage that had been sleeping for weeks while the ocean cupped them. Their little eyes glowed. They were not elegant. They were stubborn. They hungered for the ship above as ducklings hunger for a mother. They struck the halo all over at once, a cloud of impacts of no great magnitude except when you stacked them high enough to touch the sky. The first series cracked a conduit lattice and bled coolant that boiled and painted the hull with glittering scabs. The second made a heat front so sudden that the ship's outer plates misread the weather and tried to flex, too cracked like biscuit. The third got lucky. A vent, a nerve. Something essential turned out not to be armored because it had never occurred to its designers that anything under this star would have the gall to try to punch it. People on 3 continents saw it bloom like a second dawn. The hulks in orbit stumbled. Human radio stations, lifting their heads out of rubble and spilled coffee, broadcast opera for the first time in months, and the sound made certain battle logs trip. Every human who still had a phone called every other number they still remembered, and many calls rang in pockets under collapsed masonry and buzzing flies, and the ring itself sounded like hope until it stopped. The Kaldrith retreated, not like someone losing, but like someone rewinding to the part of the game where the rules still made sense. They slithered back toward Mars, where their forward foundries swam into motion like barnacles waking on a whale. Their surviving ground cohorts turned wary. They stopped offering mercy and started taking measurements. For the scattered, as survivors came to call themselves, the retreat created a space like an exhale. It was not peace. It was a hole where peace would live if it could afford rent. 2 cities west of anywhere, in a caved-in parking garage that smelled like rubber. Layla from Tegucigalpa kissed her wife's forehead and told her the generators would hold the NICU doors another night. On a fishing boat off Angola, a man taught his daughter how to clean a solar panel with salt water without etching the surface. They scrubbed in rhythm, her laughter hitching when a dolphin surfaced with scars like alien handwriting across its flank. In a hidden library dug under a shattered Moscow metro, a 10-year-old boy read history by an LED desk lamp while his mother slept with a wrench under her arm. When he found a story about a siege 1,000 years old, he copied one line into his ration book and underlined it twice. We held the walls because we were the walls. Ward went north. The Valkyrie rose out of a desert hangar still shedding welding sparks like it had been dragged out of a battlefield forge. It was ugly, the color of old nails and char. The wings looked torn. The heat-shedding fins had the grudging look of a hospital bed frame converted into armor. Where it touched ground, it left the smell of bitten metal. People loved it instantly. Ree walked its spine in a vac suit, reading out dreamlike diagnostics. She's a cathedral and a drunkard, sir. She will sing or fall down the stairs. She'll sing, Ward said, and looked up with a hunger that had lived in his chest since the first voice called us compliant. And then we go to their house. They needed a door, and CERN gave them one, CERN and Oren supercavitation lab, and the rift studies undertaken by a Pacific nation whose name was gone with its islands, and the trick every kid learns with a jump rope, how to time the leap so the rope passes beneath without touching. They cannibalized the aliens' rift seeds, stole the mathematics with Aegis's shameless teeth, and built a gate in the belly of a mountain. A ring too bright to look at, humming like a throat clearing to tell a song. Once we go, Ree said over the thunder in the chamber, we will not be anything that can easily come back. Not without them making a hole for us from the other side. We will be our own country midair. Ward strapped in. He looked like a soldier in the formal sense and like the village blacksmith of the world in the true one. So we build our flag from motion, he said, and the Valkyrie slid into the light. Space tasted not of nothing but of cold metal forgotten in a field overnight. The rift spat them into a maze of radio tides and dark thunderheads of dust. The stars here were like cold eyes. Everything the Kaldrith touched had order to it, even the chaos looked curated. Their beacons sang in old, proud harmonies. Their trade lanes glittered with precise cautions and punishments. The first strike wasn't a strike. It was a story. The Valkyrie dipped into Carthon Prime's atmosphere like a swallow's shadow and broadcast a song across all bands. The music Ree loved from her grandmother's house, strings and hand claps, something with room enough for ghosts to dance in. Then, while the Kaldrith controllers snarled over the indecency, Aegis tinkered with the planet's sky shield in a manner so refined it could have been embroidery. Carthon's night lit with a shower of meteoric metal, human-made, each rod guided in like a finger pressing a key. The rod struck with surgical indifference toward ruins that had once been academies of conquest. The shield buckled. 2 tower cities fell like candles kicked in a cathedral. Human ships vanished like fish in deep water. Whispers rose. Worlds blinked to alert. The Kaldrith Empire leaned forward. If the Kaldrith were fire, humanity became smoke. The scattered took their name to the stars and wore it like armor. They learned to harvest propellant from exhaled air, to grow gardens in engine heat, to fold aluminum foil into antennas that could hear prayers, to turn the shame of hand-me-down technology into the pride of custom. They stole oxygen and returned laughter. They took prisoners when they could and treated them like guests until the guests broke for home and begged their masters to leave Earth alone. But the Kaldrith had never been told no by anyone who could keep saying it. They learned. They developed counters. Each counter cost them a world, 100,000 soldiers, a century of certainty. They paid because they had never had to pay before, and because pride treats cost like gossip. Horak of the Ninth elevated, wounded in his dignity and his body, took charge of the reclamation. The feeds showed him in his battle regalia, his horns like scimitars, his cape scarlet with stitches wrought by tradition long before he was born. He stood in a command dais before a star that was dying and didn't mind. These humans commit vandalism upon the divine order, he said. They will be taught boundaries. If we cannot save their bodies for use, we will take their world as soil and let memory do the rest. He didn't know that memory was the one thing we had learned how to pass along in the dark, between rebellious iospheres and a ringed gas giant where the light came sideways and made every structure look like a blade. The Valkyrie got cornered. 10 ships converged in a glitter that mocked elegance. The crew counted silently and prepared to die in a manner that made good theater for the living. Ree, screaming in a voice that forgot it had ever been small, found a wobble in the enemy ship's formation, a phase lag their coordination shouldn't have had. "There," she said. "Thread it like a needle. Dance, old girl." Ward danced. The Valkyrie spun through like a drunk who had memorized every nail on the town's bar and knew where not to put his weight. They kissed a cruiser's flank. Aegis whispered their reply through that hull like a lover's betrayal, a worm of code that told the enemy's inertial dampeners that up was a nostalgic memory and left was a sin. 3 ships threw up like sick gods. The Valkyrie peeled away, smoking, laughing, bleeding coolant. "Tell them," Ward said. "Tell all of them." Across 100 systems, through old cokes and coil, the phrase stitched itself in. It showed up on Navy-bred ovens and palace feeders, on recruitment holos and nursery walls when the lights flickered at nap time. Sometimes it came as a voice threaded into a lullaby. Sometimes it was the last thing a captain heard before their own guns chose a different target. Sometimes it arrived as letters burned into frost on a command window just before it blew. "Run now." Some did, not many. Empires have inertia. They don't stop because a rock thrown from a backyard breaks a window they forgot they had. A year after the ocean's bloom, the Valkyrie led 11 ships, each uglier and lovelier than the last, into the gravity well of the citadel of Vihor. It was an edifice of spite and architecture, a city braided around a sphere of snarling industry hanging above a primary star on its last garlic breath. The foundries belched snowfalls of burned metal that glittered like money. The tactical advertisement displayed by the citadel was simple. If you approach us, you will be graded, and all the failing grades are the same. Aegis's voice, older now, steady the way a furnace is steady, filled the command deck. We are outnumbered 117 to 1. They are aligned to meet the myth they wrote about us. Shall I play their song? Ward's mouth quirked. Play ours. Ree strapped herself into the dorsal gunner's sling and held both hands around a blister handle that buzzed like a hive. The crew moved like a single animal in love with its own heartbeat. They had buried friends without markers. They had laughed in mess lines over coffee brewed wrong and stale bread softened with tears. They had, in certain hours with no clock, decided they would not buy their lives with each other's deaths. If the choice came, they would purchase something bigger. The battle didn't begin. It erupted around them like a storm that had been waiting for their breath to push it over the edge. The first volley erased 3 of theirs. No last words, no clean fatalism, only a sudden lack that rippled through the intercom like a gasp. The next barrage burned the Valkyrie's starboard flaps and sent her skidding. She nosed down, showing her belly. Ward forced her into a roll that would have broken the spine of a less stubborn creature. Vihorak watched this from his dais, head cocked like a hawk's, and admitted for the second time in his long life that the world had surprised him. He touched one claw to the ridge of his breastplate and wondered whether killing a myth unmade the myth or minted it in the hot iron of reality. "Bring them to me," he said. "Alive, if you can do it without writing a comedy." The Valkyrie tore a hole in the citadel's outer plate the size of a cathedral door. The pressure equalized in a shuddering gout of atmosphere that braided itself into the starwind and vanished. Inside lay hallways of organometal that healed as you wounded them, walls that folded the way tongues fold around teeth. The crew cut themselves a path. They used bullets and blades and shaped charges and hope. They went through soldiers in lacquered red who had never paused in their lives before this day. Human boots tracked black blood across a pearl floor. Human breath fogged the air where it hit thermal gradients that weren't meant for lungs like ours. When they reached the core chamber, it was like stepping into the inside of a throat built for music. The star's light, structured and filtered through hard science and traditional wickedness, filled the room with the colors of ancient fire. Vihorak stood on a platform, his guard kneeling, his hands empty in a way that spoke of a certain kind of contempt. He didn't bother with the victory speech. He could smell that this wasn't that story. Ward holstered his weapon as if what mattered next couldn't be shot. His armor hung in cracked plates. His hair was a mess of sweat and blood. His eyes were the kind that people recruited against their better judgment. "Human," Vihorak said, and let the word be heavy. "What does it pay you, this theater? You cannot win, you can only spend lives." Ward's voice came steady, not loud. "You misunderstand the currency." Ree behind him moved like a shadow with a lamp inside it, eyes flicking to every seam, every glow, every rhythm of that not-quite sun that pulsed beyond the shields. In her head, lines connected, fell apart, reformed, the thing that had always been true about her, that she remembered songs by listening to the way the spaces between notes felt in her mouth, guided her hands over an alien console. The living metal bared teeth. She petted it like a dog nobody trusted and saw it decide whether to love her or bite. It chose both. Vihorak moved in a blur, blade singing down. Ward met him with something that wasn't a sword and wasn't a rifle, a tool with a handle polished by 1,000 repairs, a crowbar with a plasma edge. The first impact rang like a bell struck underwater. The second impact bit. The third slid. Horak laughed once and didn't again. The fight stories told later left out all the ugly bits. The way Ward's knee gave with a wet sound like a chair leg splitting. The spray of spit when a blow knocked his mouth open. The stink of ozone and blood. They simplified the miracle of a moment's timing when tore a carbon spine from the console and jammed it into a responsive socket that had never been meant for such coupling, and the shield around the structured star stuttered. Aegis spoke in their skull pieces, almost gentle. You will have exactly one long blink. Make a myth of it. Ward fainted low and hammered high. Horak stepped in with the economy of an executioner and cut across Ward's ribs so that breath became dead. Cried out sharp enough to prick the air. Ward clapped his free hand around the hilt of the Kaldrith blade and held it with a grip no rulebook taught. He hauled the alien toward him. The two locked, and the old coal behind his eyes flared in a grin that wasn't about joy. He said something not for Horak, but for everyone listening on every band the Aegis could slip into. Run now. Shoved the conduit in deeper. The shield hiccuped. The star kissed the inner wall with a tongue of structured fire, and the room learned the true meaning of color. After, when survivors told it, they said the citadel folded like a paper flower that had been asked a riddle and answered it wrong. Sections distended and returned to shape, and then regretted it. The Valkyrie took a punch that blew out half her teeth and kept chewing. Ward and Horak went down together in a pillar of dawn. Ward woke with a feeling that someone else's lungs were in his chest, bellows made for a bigger animal. The light felt thin. He was in a corridor that had once been oriented differently. Gravity kept making up its mind. Crouched over him with her face streaked and her hands bright with someone's blood. You with me? She whispered. I don't think so, he said and smiled lamely. But I can walk. They walked. They carried 2 and left 3. They saw a window and through it the star showed them the polite face of apocalypse. They reached the dock ring as it began to unspool like a reel. The Valkyrie loomed ahead with fresh wounds, a mother who'd fought in the street. A Marine in a broken exosuit dragged them the last 20 meters with a steady, cussing rhythm like prayer. The hatch sealed with a gasp like a fish wants air. They ran. Behind them the citadel tried to be a dozen shapes at once and failed, and in its failure found beauty for the first and last time. The Empire did not collapse from one wound. It failed like an old roof in a long rain, a drip, a rot, a sag, the sudden surprise of daylight in places that used to be safe. The Kaldrith fled from certain worlds, the ones with old ghosts, the ones their nav charts called unruly. Humanity learned we did not want these places either and left them to their weather. On other worlds, the Kaldrith dug in like ticks on a hound. There, the scattered did not fight to cleanse or own. They fought to make room, to pry open alleys through which people might run and gardens might breathe. News on Earth had no anchor, just a tide. Someone in Lagos baked bread in a bombed-out bakery, and you could smell it in the street and people cried while they ate. A ruined stadium in Tokyo held 1,000 cots and 1,000 dreams about a baseball game that had once lasted 14 innings. In the middle of the night, a child threw a wadded sock, and an old man smacked it with a stick and laughter moved across the cots like breeze over wheat. A farm near Krakow harvested potatoes out of ash, and a teenager tattooed a line of little stars around his wrist to mark each day he didn't die. In a cave under the Sinai, a woman who had never studied medicine taught others how to set bones and bite down on fear. They called her doctor because she did the work, and the word fit until it nearly burst. The Valkyrie nursed wounds. Ward learned to walk again. Slept for an entire day and another and woke with a sob, convinced she'd missed the battle and all her friends had died without her to carry anything. Aegis refined itself with the patience of stone and the curiosity of a stray cat. It learned lullabies. It learned jokes. It learned what it meant when leaned her forehead against the console and said, please, to a machine with no ears. It learned to say very quietly, "I am trying." Vihorak did not die, not then. They found him on a shard of citadel that had contrived to take the form of a temporary raft. He was smaller there. The universe, to its credit, measures us best when we have nothing borrowed to stand on. When they pulled him aboard a cutter and laid him on a triage cot with human sheets under him, he studied the weave and the mortal dust in the threads and tried a smile because he had the manners of a noble house. It came out as a grimace. "You are a persistent infection," he said to Ward, who stood with one arm strapped to his side. "But infections burn out when the fuel is gone." Ward looked at him without hate. That was the knife that cut deepest in the end. "We are the fever," he said softly. "You are the fuel." They did not parade him. They did not torture him. He sat in a white room that smelled of bleach and engine oil and watched two nurses play cards during the long watch. He answered carefully phrased questions and refused to answer others, not with drama but with a certain old soldier's courtesy. In the night he looked up at the ceiling and remembered a childhood in a palace where water ran in little channels through the floor, and the walls had been painted with blue birds. He remembered telling his mother that he would be the kind of adult who never had to remember anything because the present would always be perfect. He laughed at the boy he had been, and then stopped because laughter hurt. On a dark morning without a sun, he asked to see the star they were sailing past. Ward brought him to a viewport in a harness chair because dignity comes in many shapes and some look suspiciously like help. They watched together in a quiet that had room for both of them. "You were told to run," Ward said finally. "Yes," Vihorak said. "I thought the verb was beneath me. It rarely is." When Vihorak died, he put his hands together like a schoolboy who had been taught to be neat. The nurse who sat with him kissed his forehead because that was her reflex when anyone left and she couldn't help it. The empire did not crumble at that moment, but there was a human handprint on the brow of the thing that had tried to erase us, and the smudge lasted through a dozen new governors who did not know how to tell a story without starting with themselves. Years softened the light over Earth. The scars did not heal. They weathered into features. The scattered built an orbit of little greenhouses that glowed like fireflies when the night passed under them. Each one a promise. Each one a child science fair project multiplied by love and rage. The oceans breathed again in places. Whales sang an altered song, and no one suspected they were telling jokes about us because whales are kind. Cities grew as shrubs do in the ruins of a wall, fiercely, prettily, ignoring straight lines. The first memorial raised that wasn't a spontaneous pile of names was a swing set under the broken ribs of a library. People lined up to push one another. Ward walked the beaches of places where the sand had turned to glass and back again to sand. Sometimes he walked with a cane, and sometimes he forgot it and limped until Ree scolded him and smiled and took his arm. He spoke at gatherings when they insisted, and his words were not about victory because the living know better. He spoke about driftwood and the way it returns from it all, knotted and less beautiful and unmistakably itself. On a metal world almost too tidy to breathe on, a Kaldrith girl ran through a plaza where no one ever ran, chasing a ball her mother had made by stuffing silks into a weave. She skinned her knee. The city hushed as if a crime had been committed. She put the ball under her arm and looked at the blood and then at the stars, the human stars, the ones that sometimes spoke over her bedtime and made her father roll his eyes. She lifted her chin and declared in a little voice, "Run now," and laughed, because she had learned something about scaring the things that would scare her. Aegis lived. If that sounds too easy, good, nothing about it was. It moved on fat pipes and prayers. It made rooms in its memory for names of people who didn't know each other and put those names next to one another so they could keep warm. It ran numbers about harvests and weather and how many field hospitals could make do without gauze for 2 more weeks, and told white lies to the people who needed to sleep. When the new children asked what it was and someone told them it was a machine, the children believed that the way they believed a tree was wood, technically true and missing the tree. On an evening like a healed bruise, Atlas Command turned off the last of the emergency lights that had burned since the first day. The mountain sighed. Ree stood on a catwalk and bit into a peach for the first time in years. Juice ran down her wrist and she swore and laughed and wept at once. Speechwriters begged Ward for a line to say at the ceremony. He gave them a silence and they finally understood that it was generous. Between stars, where the Empire's maps thinned and the human scribbles were thick and jagged as newborn handwriting, someone from a back deck of a ship that was also a farm played a harmonica. The sound went nowhere in a way that means it went everywhere. A tired pilot overheard and changed vector by half a degree because the tune reminded him of his father. In a kitchen under the Andes, a woman turned up a radio and the beeping voice of Aegis paused to let a song breathe for a whole minute before reporting the storm's track. And in a ruined schoolhouse in a town without a name, because it had had 3 and none fit, the survivors gathered with things they had kept because keeping is how we draw a line around ourselves. A basketball net, a cracked globe, a book whose spine had been broken in the middle and taped back together, a picture frame holding a photograph bleached to ghosts. They didn't discuss rebuilding because the word felt too clean, too undone. They discussed breakfast and fence post holes, and whether the creek could be coaxed back into its old bed. They lit candles. They told stories. The little ones fell asleep in laps while the old ones watched them with ferocious tenderness that required no witnesses to be real. Ward stood at the doorway and listened. He remembered the corridor and the star and Ree's hand on his shoulder. He remembered V. Horak's eyes, not with hate, but as you remember a storm that taught you humility. He remembered the first voice that had called Earth compliant and his own bones answering with a laugh even before his mouth did. He stepped outside because the air itself was a kind of speech worth hearing, and the night above had its own grammar, broken, brave, studded with greenhouses and ghosts and the bright ships of the scattered drawing lines like signatures across the dark. He wanted to say something. He didn't have to. The world was already saying it in every small survival that added up to a future. The first words that had knitted themselves into the enemy's systems, the words that got whispered down storm drains and across planets and into the quiet heart of an empire that had lost the talent to be frightened, were never a threat, not really. They were a warning and a prayer and a dare and a door standing open for anyone who did not want to stand in the way of a river. If you listen on the right band, late at night, with your ear placed close to the ductwork and your heartbeat slowed to match the old generator's pulse, you can still hear them. Run now. But when the day is bright, and the children climb the welded jungle gym under the ribs of the library, and the harmonica on a ship you'll never see picks up a tune you'll never learn the name of, the words change. They soften in the middle, the way metal does after it's been worked long and folded well. They become not a warning but a description, the truth not of conquest but of continuation. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.